So my kids tell me. So sorry about the technical glitches. Apologize for that. My name's Clarke Cummings, and I've been doing information security, solely information security, for about 15 years, and a few years before that. I'm getting to the point where I'm a little sensitive about saying how many years before that I was doing system integration, so we'll just leave it with I've got a fair bit of information security experience. A good part of that has been focused on security operations, security event management, and those types of activities, as well as a lot of general information security topics. So I got a decent background in the topic that we're going to be talking about. Also have been fairly active a while back working with the local Central Ohio chapter here, and helping out with the CISSP classes. So I see some familiar faces from those classes, as well as other people that I've had the pleasure of working with in the past. So real quick, want to go through and talk about some of the ways that you can measure the effectiveness of your information security operations program. So we'll talk a little bit about secure, monitor, respond, which is hate to use the word paradigm, but a very useful paradigm for how we're dealing with information security right now and the way organizations are looking at things. Talk about the changing landscape, how things have been migrating over the past 5-6 years or so, and a little bit of where we see things moving into the future, how we measure security operations, the value of developing a plan, and then lessons learned. I always stick questions at the end, but the way I like to go through these is anytime you have a question, just raise your hand. Let me know. I'm happy to address those at that time, so you don't have to wait until the end. So, secure, monitor, respond. What am I talking about when I'm looking at these individual categories? And a lot of organizations, might call them something a little bit different. But basically, on the secure front, we're looking at the area where we're adopting either individual controls over the systems that we have. So your access controls for sensitive databases, the encryption on sensitive information. Or we're looking at specific security tools. Some of those have grown, quite a bit from, your old stateful packet in firewalls to, be quite robust today. But really, those are focused on, solving, a point problem or a handful of problems. When you look at a lot of the, ISO 27001 and the, the BS 7799 or 17799 that it's grew into, those are looking at individual controls on elements that they're saying you should be protecting. PCI, GLBA, a lot of those also look at individual controls as well. For the monitoring part, we're looking at taking a look at what's going on within the environment, understanding the feedback that we're getting from the other tools that we already have in place, taking that information, making sense of it, and then, if you see an incident that happens, be able to then move into the response phase. So on the response side of the house, this goes beyond, seeing something, doing an investigation to determine whether or not it's an issue or not. This is, we saw something, it's definitely an issue. We need to take and move from having identified that to move to isolation, eradication, and recovery from those types of events. So all of these should incorporate people, process, and technology. And then if you like, you can mix governance in with those two, or you can have it as a fourth category. But really, you're trying to pull those pieces together for secure, monitor, response. Traditionally, we've been heavily focused on the secure phase, really paying attention to, what is the next kind of gizmo that we can get that's going to help prevent, something bad from happening within our environment. So, it's the individual controls, the point products that are out there. Started with, let's get a firewall, we get a firewall, everything's going to be great. How did that work out? Wasn't enough. The crunchy on the outside, soft on the inside, M&M, not the wrapper, analogy. So we've evolved. We said, okay, that's not good enough. We need to make sure we do a really good job with patch management, because if we patch all of our systems and eliminate those vulnerabilities, we're going to have everything perfect, right? And that worked out about this much. Can't ignore it, but it's not the be-all, end-all to the environment. So when you look at this, this is really heavily driven by the checkbox mentality. So I've got to meet HIPAA high-tech, or I've got to meet PCI compliance. PCI says I need to have a firewall and I need to have sensitive data encryption. Check, got it. I've got an encryption key database that doesn't have much security around it. People could get in there, take my keys, and do whatever they want with my data, but I've met that checkbox. So historically, the spend that organizations have been doing looks a lot like about 85% looking at those controls and the products, 10% on monitoring, and 5% on responding. The effort that people put into the organizations looks about the same from a breakdown. So moving on, we've started to have a realization that's been taking place that this type of a view of information security isn't really sufficient anymore. We can keep putting in point solutions after point solution and never get to a place where we've got the level of security that we think is really necessary to protect the assets that we have within the organization. The number of people who will open up any email sent to them is extremely high. And I am sure that Fishme and Aaron would be happy if they haven't already or aren't at some other point during this week talking about it. Because, phishing is one of the easiest means of gaining access to an environment. So you've got a well-meaning employee or somebody who wants to do you wrong. They've got legitimate access. People are going to be able to take advantage of that. So it's almost impossible to put security controls in place that's going to be able to stop that. And now we're starting to recognize, and this is more of an idealistic picture than what's actually happening, but organizations are starting to shift away from let's buy a new security control, put it in place, to let's think about things from a little more balanced perspective. To throw out another buzzword, we talked a lot about holistic, but we're finally starting to get to the area where we're actually pursuing that. So we're splitting up the secure, monitor, and respond capabilities a little more evenly. And this has been a target, that's evolved based on experience. So from security operations perspective, notice I didn't say security operations center. So we're thinking a little bit more broadly than just having a SOC that's, managing all of this. In some organizations, the SOC is going to be the primary component that drives your security operations perspective. But in reality, some organizations don't have the capability to have a full-blown SOC. Maybe they aren't at a size where that's something that's going to be realistic, or that's a target that they're working to down the road. But security operations is really looking at the ability to do that monitor component. So you've got a number of tools that are already in place. How do you take that information that you have and effectively leverage it from a monitoring perspective? So that's the security operations. You're looking at alerts, developing reports, tracking information that's coming in from the various feeds that you have, somebody looking at that information and making sense of that data. So once upon a time, and I think I've talked to some people in the room, I focused on selling SIM solutions. And they're helpful and they're useful, but they can't do everything. So you've got to keep in mind that it goes beyond just having another tool that's being involved there. It's actually technology plus people and processes and how those things fit together. So how are we going to measure that effectiveness? You know, when we have a security operation function, how do we understand how all of that things fits together? And this is a hard problem, right? It's not easy. If you look at, you know, organizational leadership literature, you know, Harvard Business School isn't built around how to build a better widget. It's on how to figure out what's the most effective way to run a business. And security operations is a small part of your business. You need to be focused on meeting business goals and drivers and not just on protecting information. So it's a little bit broader problem than a lot of people think of. There's a lot of different models that you can use to measure that effectiveness. But one of the ones that I have found that has been really useful, it's got high adoption across information technology, information systems, is looking at using Carnegie Mellon's Software Enterprise Institute's Capability Maturity Model. So the CMM. People familiar with that? Have heard it as an acronym thrown around? So the CMM, and actually Carnegie Mellon's gone through a lot of changes and set this up a bit as a service and are certifying people in organizations. I don't necessarily think I'd go that far. I think they're just taking advantage of the bandwagon where people want to have an external force say that yes or no, you're here or there. But it provides a nice model that talks about the adoption of information systems within organizations. And it has 5 levels that we'll touch on here in a second. And they're pretty easy to get and understand. But they're also easy to apply to different situations. So where it was initially focused on software development people, it's expanded beyond that and is set up so that you can use it for organizations as well as just the software development world. So I mentioned there were 5 different levels. Starting with level 1, which is the lowest level, it's pretty much, you could call it the pants on fire, or hair on fire maybe, because pants on fire is taken by the fact check people. The hair on fire level it's ad hoc, it's chaotic, inconsistent. You don't really have anything down on paper. And if you ask 2 different people to do the same thing, there's a pretty good chance you're going to get 2 different results. Pretty much nothing is documented. There might be a single page sheet that says, here's what we do, and that's pretty much about it. So a lot of organizations, when they start at level 1, and then level 2, you're starting to recognize a need for more formalized processes and procedures in order to be able to move forward. We're hitting the level where we're starting to see consistency take shape. You have a higher chance of 2 different people doing the same thing the same way. But a lot of the processes and procedures and practices are going to be driven by not so much documented policies, although there may be some documentation, but a lot of word of mouth. People saying, hey, here's how we do this here. When you do it this way. Somebody takes notes, got it. I know how to do this now. So that's level 2. You're hitting the repeatable phase. You get to level 3, and things are now defined. You're much more easily hitting that repeatable level of consistency. So you've got things that happen pretty much the same way every single time. You're starting to see some highly developed documentation that goes into detail on what needs to be happening when. Becomes a lot easier to train new people when they come in if you have turnover and things like that. Level 4 is managed. That really focuses on using metrics now to start driving that consistency that we're looking for. And it's focused on the as-is environment. Where do things stand today? The information that we have coming in, we help to improve the environment. Level 5 moves on to optimized. And here at level 5, we're really using the metrics that we had in 4, but we're driving forward with continuous process improvement. So as you see something, you've got the ability to adjust. We're adding a lot more automation, which we started to drive in level 4 as well, I should have mentioned. And we're moving forward to look at the to-be state in addition to the as-is state. So it really is an evolution perspective. At a minimum, you really should shoot for being level 3, hitting that defined level pretty much for anything you do within your organization. If it's something you're going to do more than 2 times, I would say you want to have the processes, procedures, practices around that all in a defined state. So that if there's turnover, if somebody leaves, the proverbial bus, you're going to be able to say, you know, okay, Clarke got ran over. I can take somebody off the street, put them into Clarke's job, because I'm not that unique, and have them do it and probably get the same result Clarke was getting. Except for when Clarke was heavily medicated, like a couple weeks ago on cough medicine. So now we have to know, what is it we're trying to measure? What are we trying to get to? Well, when we think about security operations, you know, we want to have that monitoring environment. You could apply, you know, these 5 levels to the practices around the individual controls that are in place, and that's a good idea. But from security operations, we're trying to figure out, you know, what we want to look like. So I mentioned here, every organization is going to be different. So I can't pop up on a slide and say, here's your reference architecture and target state for security operations, because you're going to have different needs and requirements. So one of the things that's a good exercise about trying to derive measurements on effectiveness is you've got to sit down and figure out what your organization is supposed to be doing around security operations. You know, what is going to be effective for one organization won't necessarily be effective for another one. So, you know, what's security operations' role in the organization? You know, obviously you're focused on, you know, protecting information assets, deriving some extra value out of tools that have already been invested, controls that are already in place. You need a reference architecture. What does security operations look like within your organization? We'll talk a little bit more on that. You need to have a target state in mind, because if you don't know what the target state should be, you know, there's not really a lot that you can measure. You can say, I've got this function and that function, and we do or don't have processes, but you really need to know where it is you think you need to be in order to drive that. And then, like I mentioned, don't forget governance, because we're in the governance room, so I've been told I have to say that at least 5 times. Governance. 3. You know, there's a lot of different schools of thought. It's either rolled into people, process, technology, or people measure it as a standalone. Don't care. Either way, I typically roll it in and have here in this conversation as well. So, what should your reference architecture include? Right? We want to look at the things that need to be part of your security operations. So we'll break it down: people, process, technology. On the process front, you're going to have customer-facing services. Customer being probably business units. Maybe you run you know, a consolidated model where you've got independent business organizations. Or agencies, Rick, could be customers. So it's not necessarily, you know, an external third party that's showing up to buy something. But for them, you've got to provide them with results. You've got to give them reports. You've got to help them understand what their threats are within their environment. Consult with them to understand what content they need that you can then produce to help understand what's happening in the environment. There's going to be internal services, so the actual monitoring that takes place, the care and feeding of the systems and processes that are there. You know, being able to keep those things up and running, working, the reporting, process management, those kind of things are all internal services. There's also external interfaces that you're going to have. Might be with third-party vendors, working with a third party to make sure you're getting the right functionality out of your products. Working with information sharing and analysis centers. So I know a lot of organizations, especially financial services, as well as government, tend to do some information sharing through ISACs. And they're a nice way to get that information into your monitoring program so that you're looking at problems that other people are facing as well. You also need that external interface so you can feed into that system, so other people can take advantage of what you're seeing. The jury's still out on whether or not the government, once you get outside of some specific areas, is going to be able to do a good information around that from a federal perspective. But there's some hope around that. Support services is another important aspect. How does this process integrate with your help desk? What about the people that are doing asset management? Because having a lot of information about everything that's going on in your organization is great, but if I don't have the hooks into the asset management people to really understand, who's running a system, what the purpose is, there's some things that you should be doing around that. And then process governance. So, how does this, how do we keep things on track? Is there a committee involved? Because committees always do things better. So actually, there is some research that teams tend to make better decisions than individuals, provided you avoid things like groupthink. On the people side, do we have the right individuals working, figuring things out, and moving the organization forward? So you're going to say, we need to provide this set of services, and then you need to have the right people in place to be able to deliver those services. They need to have experience. They need to have training. There needs to be an organizational model to keep things rolling along. Might be 2 people. Might be a team of 45. Every organization is going to be different, and that's why it's important to have your own reference architecture. Technology side. So SIM is a big component of your security information and event management, is a big component of monitoring and understanding what's going on in the environment. The tools are designed to take in a lot of information from a lot of different systems that you can then analyze. You can set up correlations, reporting, alerting. You can automate processes out of. So it is fairly important. Now, there's a lot of different products out there. A lot of people have built their own types of systems. So there's a number of different ways that you can leverage that. IDS, IPS is one of the things that you need to consider as well, because that does a lot of automated monitoring of traffic that's flowing across your network. Gives a little bit more visibility into what's happening than some of the other tools that are out there. A lot of people are also investigating network forensics tools, but event source support. This falls under SIM. Depending on what devices you have in your environment, you need to make sure that you've got processes around how you can manage the data from those. If you're a healthcare organization, so many devices are networked nowadays and have the ability to provide information about potential tampering. The guy that's got his leg surgery wants a little bit extra morphine in his drip. The drug control rooms now are fairly automated as well. So, there's a number of different event sources for them to think about from a healthcare perspective. So how do you have that information, take advantage of it, and understand who's using it? And then third-party integration. So, how can we take information from threat intelligence services and take advantage of it? How do we leverage, again, the ISOCs that are out there that are providing detail? Integrating with vulnerability management is often pretty important. 10 years ago we said patching was everything. You need to do patching, you need to set up vulnerability management tools. Well, this is a perfect time to start taking advantage of that. pull that information into security operations and really leverage it. You know, as you start to see things coming through your system, wouldn't it be nice to say, oh my gosh, that is a really bad vulnerability or attack going against the system, but then be able to say, oh, look, it takes advantage of, you know, something Microsoft or Apple or, you know, one of the other vendors didn't patch, and we've got it patched in our environment, so we don't have to worry about it. Allows you to get through some of the, separate the wheat, so to speak. Target state. This is starting to fill out some of those details. Reference architecture, usually fairly graphical display. Now we start to put in some individual components underneath it. You know, when we talk about SIM, what are the actual functions that we need to have? Does it need to be able to do advanced cross-device correlation, or can we get away with something simplistic? You know, does it need to have the ability to store data for, you know, 7 years with easy key management so that we can get at it down the road because of some regulation that we have in place? So start listing these kind of requirements out, and then as you go through to do your assessment, you know, you can set it up to say, yes, we do this, no, we don't do this. So the technology is always the easiest to develop a target state for, because you can say, you know, we need an IDS, IPS that does this, we need these event sources, and we need a SIM capable of whatever. When you start looking at the processes, we got to look back to the reference architecture. So we want to have customer-facing services. And in those services, we want a consultation capability, we want a training so we can train our customers, and we want a reporting function. Maybe those are the three that we really want to focus on. So from a target state perspective, what does the reporting feature look like? You know, or do we need to have to report when there might be something that happened, or are we only going to report to them when we're confident that something bad has happened against them? So, you know, we've got to figure that out, write it down so that we can go back and take a look at it. So always a good idea to write these down in a spreadsheet, because it makes it a little bit easier as you go through to do the analysis to pull the individual pieces together. Gives us what we're going to measure against, and then if you don't know where you're going, how are you going to know when you get there? So that's the bottom line of the target state. So from measuring perspective, so now we're getting into taking our target state and reference architecture that we've used to say where we think we need to be. That's driven by, you know, the sensitive information that you might have within the organization, by regulations that you might have to follow, or standards that you've decided to set for yourself. Frameworks. Maybe you say we're going to be an ISO 27000 shop, or you know, we have to do COBIT or something like that. So now we start taking the feedback that we have and applying it to the individual elements. So, you know, the requirements that your SIM should meet, go through those. Do we have a SIM in place that can handle everything within our environment? That's probably a maybe. You know, right now, today, we've got it handling X, but in a year or two, it needs to be able to handle Y. So we get a partial check mark there. You know, can it do reporting that we need it to do? Does it have robust reporting capabilities? Can maybe we downloaded a lot of information? Does it do advanced analytics? So you're actually getting in there, determining whether or not these individual functions are actually going to be there. The event sources, are we getting the right information into our system? Do we have the third-party integrations that I talked about that we want to make sure we have? There's a lot of really good third-party integrations. You know, taking data from ISOCs, integrating with asset management, vulnerability management system, really provides a lot of robust information to the environment for your monitoring capabilities. Identify integration points between the different systems. How are they going to work together? You know, on the IDS, IPS side, you have to determine whether or not you need the P in IPS. You know, are you actually going to set it up to do some prevention services, or are you going to filter that up and let an investigation determine whether or not something needs to take place around that? Hey, look, documentation. Make sure you've got documentation about how the technology should be run, and that you're not just thinking about what the system needs to be able to do, but how do we keep it up and running, supporting the environment as well. Care and feeding, making sure it's getting patched, new releases, those kind of things. Oh, and at the bottom, architecture. You got to make sure it's going to be able to grow to support future demand as well. So from a process perspective, now we're getting into, those kind of things. Our customer-facing processes, third-party interaction, maybe interactions with law enforcement. The activities and the things that need to happen around that all need to have processes and procedures defined so that when something does happen, especially something that's not fairly typical, like jumping in and calling law enforcement, that doesn't happen a whole lot of times. So developing and making sure you have a process for how that takes place is going to be really important. Some of these areas also end up with a fair bit of churn among the people that are working there. So having processes and procedures helps to lessen the impact of losing resources and having new ones come into the organization. You want to make sure that you're addressing all of the tasks that need to be handled to address the services that you've developed, and you want to make sure that they're documented. So documentation goes beyond just saying this is our process. You should have process flow charts, descriptions on the steps that need to take place, RACI charts that explain, the responsible, accountable, informed from the RACI side of things, and have metrics that are driven from these processes. How long should it take for an investigation to take place before there's at least some initial notification that takes place? Maybe you've got something really complicated and it's going to take longer, but at least something needs to come out. And then make sure you're not forgetting the governance elements as well. That's what, 4? So governance 4 times? 5 is the magic number. So measuring on the people front. Pretty easy, You've got a set of services that you want to offer, some technology that needs to be managed, both from a supportability perspective, keeping the lights on, if you will, as well as from an operational perspective. When you're looking at monitoring, there's a constant need to develop new content. And there's also a constant need to analyze security intelligence. Those two things are fairly commonly forgotten about. I'm going to buy my widget, I'm going to put my widget in place, and it's going to magically, do a lot of this work for me. Content development is really important because you've got a lot of information that's out there. You could go to SANS every day, look at the top 20 list, make sure you're addressing all of those within your monitoring environment. You can, go to, the Internet Threat Center and make sure that you've got, what's the most important threats today being monitored. But you've got your customers that you need to think of as well. So being able to take their requirements, translate it into something useful from a monitoring perspective is pretty important. Retaining individuals is very important to keep things running effectively. And that can be a challenge in some situations. So that's something that you need to think of. Training, and then making sure that you've got the right skills. So are the people going to be able to address, the different requirements that we have? And the intelligence piece that I talked about, having somebody who can make sense of the information that's coming in through the environment. Develop a plan of action. So we've gone through the exercise. We've looked at people, process, technology. I suggested that you put it into a spreadsheet so that you can look at each one of those capabilities, give it a score, and then come up with how you're doing around those types of elements. Once you've done that, you need to take a look and see where you're deficient. You want to leverage the risk assessments that have been done within an organization, provided they haven't been focused on individual controls. Hopefully they've been a little bit broader at understanding who the threat actors are that we're facing, and what risks we're going to see from them, so that you can have, a bigger picture of what needs to happen. So evaluate those, work on figuring out which deficiencies are going to be most impactful to your organization. And I'm going to say that if you are missing a technology, it's probably not going to be your most important element. Not having the right people, not having the right processes, those are the things that are probably going to rise to the top. Being able to make sure that you have those elements addressed. You want to take a look at also making sure that when you're addressing those, you're doing it effectively. Doesn't all have to be done in-house. You can outsource functionality. A lot of people will outsource, at least initially, a forensics capability. Set up a retainer within an organization. Maybe you get involved with some law enforcement type stuff, and you make those connections when you don't necessarily need to have them. And then create a roadmap. How are we going to get to our final target state? So some of the lessons learned, you've got to understand who the threat actors are. It's not enough just to say, we've got this sensitive information, and we know we need to take care of it, and so let's go to it. But actually understand, who is it that's trying to get to your data? If you're a financial institution, a healthcare institution, it's pretty easy. People want to steal PII so that they can create their own, credit accounts to steal money at some point down the road. Financial institution, you also have to worry about people that are trying to actually get the money. Setting up the scheme where they steal all the half cents, like in Superman 2, and those kind of things. So, make sure you're using risk modeling effectively. The risk assessment where we say, do we need to implement Y, isn't really effective. Looking at the broader picture, leveraging threat actors, plus a good understanding of what our sensitive assets are, is really where you need to be focused from a risk perspective. Security operations isn't a one-size-fits-all. I can't tell you this is what your model should look like. You need to sit down, you need to think about it. Maybe you need some external help to have somebody take a look at it with you, but each case is going to be unique. You want to understand, what that target is so that you can measure towards it. Leverage existing tools that you have already in place. You probably aren't going to have to go out and buy a whole lot of new toys. I'm sorry for those of you who like to buy new toys, because I enjoy them quite a bit as well. But there's a lot that you can do with what's already in-house. Might have to expand some things, update some licenses, but you're probably in good shape. Don't forget governance. There's number 5. And then document, automate, document. So having documentation is really important. I like to, if I'm going to do something more than twice, automate around it so that I'm not stuck doing the same thing over and over and over again. Might take me, 40 hours to automate something that only takes me 2 minutes to do. But at some point, when I get to do it in 5 minutes, I'm going to have a nice return on investment around that. And then Star Wars is only 269 days away, I think. So restore balance to the Force. Questions, feel free to email me, clarke.cummings@gmail.com. So sorry about the technical glitches. Does anyone have any questions right now? Yes. For log retention? Yeah, I'm a consultant, so all my answers are it depends. A lot of tools now have some good capabilities built into that. They get a high compression ratio. In some cases, it makes sense, especially if you have really long retention policies, to look at a specific appliance that's going to be able to do that. It also depends on your tool, too. Any other questions? Yep. Depends. So I would say financial services institutions tend to fall at the 3 and 4. They might have some practices that are going to hit 5. Healthcare, you're going to be, healthcare, manufacturing are going to be 1 and 2s with some 3s. Retail's probably going to hit the middle, a couple things that are 2, a couple things that are 4, but really a lot that falls into that 3 category. A lot of that is driven by the compliance that they have to deal with. Others? Thank you very much. I appreciate the time that you've taken today.